So good afternoon and a warm welcome to everybody in the audience at Yale and to those of you tuning in online. My name is Justin Lindenmayer. I'm a third-year joint degree student between the School of Management and School of Forestry. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the topic for the panel discussion today, as well as our moderator, Errol Schweizer, who is Whole Foods Senior Global Grocery Coordinator, sitting right here. Today's panel discussion, Food and Sustainability, Access and Impacts, is sponsored by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment in collaboration with the Yale Sustainable Food Project and the Yale Office of Sustainability, and is being broadcast live through the Yale Livestream channel. And before I introduce Errol, I want to mention that as part of this ongoing collaboration between Yale and Whole Foods that we've been referring to today, Lee Kane, who those of you who've been here for the day know who he is. He and a number of his Whole Foods colleagues will actually be returning to campus on Wednesday, November 7th for one of the, to take part in Yale Sustainable Food Project's Chewing the Fat speaker series. This year's theme is institutional food buying, and Whole Foods will represent the retail sector perspective. So we really look forward to that, and stay tuned for more details. We're incredibly lucky today to have Errol serve as moderator for this panel of experts who are as diverse as they are distinguished in terms of their food expertise. Over his 18 years of experience in food retail, Errol has done everything from coordinating a CSA and co-op market and managing overnight stock crews to running the helm of Whole Foods' global grocery program. So to say he knows what makes a product stand out on the shelf would be a gross understatement. Errol and his team have brought thousands of the industry's culinary finds and foodie treasures to Whole Foods grocery aisles, and through their procurement decisions, have helped lead the charge on ethical sourcing, expanding organic and non-GMO choices, and providing options that meet every kind of special diet in existence. Errol has also played an integral role in developing, driving, and launching Whole Foods' EcoScale rating system, which is the most comprehensive set of household cleaning standards in the industry, designed to help shoppers make smarter, greener choices for their homes and for the planet. Errol's passion for food, the environment, and business make him an invaluable asset to the natural and organic industry, and he will be a key player for many years to come, and we're thrilled to have him here today. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming him to Yale.
Thanks, dude. Hi, I'm a product of the State University system in New York, so it's an honor to be up here in the Ivy Leagues. So my gig at Whole Foods is to be the global grocery coordinator, and we're responsible for about 30 to 31% of product sales at Whole Foods. And what we've really seen over the last few years is, as our focus on sustainability and green mission and product quality and transparency has intensified, we've just done better as a program, as a team, as a company. And so I mentioned before that it's really core to our business to do these things and to address these issues. And I really like this program of bridging academia and the retail sector, as I'm essentially a failed academic. I did apply to a couple of grad programs and didn't get in, so not bitter. Point is, though, to have an intellectual and literate basis, sort of a praxis of understanding of what you're doing, even if you're a grocer, is really important because the issues are so intense, and you can't have economic growth on a dead planet, and so there's a lot of folks at Whole Foods who are really passionate about actually preserving our ecosystems, making sure that we have the healthiest food on shelf, and that our customers understand down to an ingredient level what they are buying from us. That transparency and ethical sourcing is so core to what we do that I couldn't imagine Whole Foods Market without it. And so over the years, we've seen tremendous growth on organic foods. We're America's leading retailer of non-GMO verified items. We've helped really bring Fairtrade to market in this country. The EcoScale program was 4 years in the making. Basic impetus there is just tell people what's in their cleaning products and then create some sort of level for helping them understand what's better. And using those ideas across the store, it's because of the reading that a lot of us do, whether it's influenced by Wes Jackson or Wendell Berry or Michael Pollan or some of the folks here on the panel. And so I think that this is a really great initiative that we need to push forward. And so some of the themes that we're going to try to touch on today, I'm going to sort of back up and let the panelists handle are pretty broad. I'd like to give everybody on the panel a few minutes and then open it up to questions, sort of catalyze further discussions and ideas. But some of the things that we're going to try to touch on include, the aspect of supply chain. Who are you buying from? What are you buying from? How are you buying it? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What are some of the victories and benchmarks you've had? But also, where do we still need to go? And I say that with all seriousness, working in a packaged goods sector. I mean, we sell a lot of stuff that ends up in a landfill in grocery, right? And so as good as we think we are now, we have to get better, right? And so I'm asking the panelists to touch on that as well. Looking at local versus global. Well, I work for a national food retailer. We have 337 odd stores stretched across 34 states. Local sourcing is core and intrinsic to what we do, but we also have products that we have to ship across state lines. Supply chains on a local level in terms of working with the actual producers, the challenges, looking at the product mix, the quality, what the folks in the area want to eat and want to buy, and that's different as you get across the country, obviously, and how that affects your ability on a financial level, on an institutional level, to make that happen. And then finally, once again, getting back to the bigger picture, human health, environmental sustainability, long-term happiness of all the stakeholders involved, and got to keep all that stuff in mind, because what we're trying to do now, that whole notion of the 7th generation, right? And I'm not just talking about the cleaning soap, which is a great product, by the way, but the notion that, what we're doing now, to keep in mind 7 generations down the line, it's a Haudenosaunee Iroquois saying, and I think it's really important as we're looking at that as operators and academics to make sure that we're keeping that in mind as we do what we do. So I'm going to pass the mic here to somebody whose work I've actually read and come across, and I'm honored to be sitting next to him, Dr. Kelly Brownell.
Thank you. Well, I was inspired just by the few things you said about the work that Whole Foods is doing, and of course knowing what the chain represents and the sort of products that it delivers to so many people across the country. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I direct a center at Yale called the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity. Our task is to work at the intersection of science and public policy. So we hope to do science that will be informative to policymakers, helpful in the policymaking process, and useful for the public to learn about in terms of making decisions about public policies regarding obesity, but about nutrition in general. So we're very involved, for example, in school nutrition policy and what's available to children in their school lunches, school breakfast, in other parts of the school day. We've been very involved in economic changes that might help improve diet, with soda taxes being probably the most controversial of those. We worked on various issues like the portion size proposal by Mayor Bloomberg in New York City. We work very heavily in the area of food marketing and what sort of products are being marketed, particularly to children. And as you might guess, most of the food companies are marketing their worst products to children, and doing so in very aggressive ways, starting at very young ages and infiltrating a child's life in ways you couldn't begin to imagine, and are so different from what marketing I might have been exposed to as a child. So we're working on these issues, trying to find what the drivers of poor diet and obesity are, and then thinking of structural changes that government might make in order to help produce changes that can affect many, many people at the same time. So we know there are lots of people working at the local level. Food co-ops, CSAs, all these sort of things are there to help people in the local level, which we believe is very important. We want to support that as much as possible. But we also think there's a constructive role for state, local, and federal governments and global organizations to play as well in creating conditions that make it easy to make healthy choices rather than hard. So as in a pretty obvious example of that would be nutrition in schools. If you serve crappy foods in schools, kids will eat crappy foods and their diet will deteriorate. If you get rid of those foods and offer only healthy foods, kids will improve their diet. They tend not to overcompensate by eating more of the unhealthy or the less healthy foods later on, and so you get an improvement in diet. So you could work really hard to educate children one at a time to make healthier choices in the presence of a bad environment, or you can try to clean up the environment, and that's the level at which we're working, although we realize, as I said before, that lots of people doing lots of things are important. I'd like to discuss briefly a broad issue, a global issue, and then one more specific to the food retailing world. On the broad level, we think a lot about how there are three major food crises that face the world, and how the people working on these tend not to be connected with one another, and how that misses a tremendously important opportunity. So the three world food crises we think about are undernutrition and hunger. I think of them as opposite or different points of a triangle. Undernutrition and hunger would be at one place. Obesity and overnutrition would be at a second part. And those two problems now affect about the same number of people globally. It's about 1 billion people are undernourished, hungry, and about 1 billion are overnourished and overweight. By the way, some of you probably know that in countries like India and China, overweight is becoming a more important health problem than underweight. Whoever would have thought that day would have arrived. You very often find hunger and obesity coexisting, certainly in the same country, very often in the same city, and surprisingly even in the same households. And so how can we have a world that produces these food crises like this when there's enough food to go around, at least for the time being? And then the third part of the triangle is the environmental impact of modern food production. And each of these is a very important, pressing social problem that needs immediate, assertive, aggressive attention. But each of these areas of the triangle tend to be represented by different constituencies. There are NGOs that care about one of those, but not all three. There are government organizations, global groups that care about one, but not all three. And sometimes, and very often, there are missed opportunities for the people who work on these to come together and have a common voice that could be much more politically powerful than any one of them working individually. So there's a missed opportunity there. But sometimes the areas work at cross purposes and disagree with one another. So an example would be the controversy over whether food stamps should be used to buy sugared beverages. And you have the obesity public health community saying, how much sense does it make for the government to be spending $2, $3, $4 billion a year buying soda and then have to pay for the diabetes that comes from it afterwards? And you have the hunger community saying that people are already stigmatized because of being poor. Now you want to take away something from them that'll stigmatize them even further. Both points of view completely legitimate, but if these two sides of the triangle were working together, you might come up with some resolution and some policy solution that would satisfy everybody. So we're working hard to think about how the worlds could come together at the three parts of the triangle and how you could push ahead social movements around the world that would benefit all three parts of the triangle and create social good more rapidly than what you might be seeing now. A more specific thing I wanted to mention is about food retailing. In my field of obesity prevention, people have been mainly focused either on individual programs aimed at individuals at the community level, or working with or opposing the food industry in a way that will bring them around to creating better products. And it's only been about the past year and a half that the retail sector has been brought into this discussion. And people have begun to think about where people buy food and whether those environments could be changed in a way that would improve diets of the whole population. And certainly changing the product mix in a given retail environment is one way to do that, with Whole Foods being the obvious leader in doing that. But there's also a lot of thought to how modern supermarkets are structured and how they could be structured differently in order to encourage healthy choices. So for example, what's at eye level for children would be an example of that. And if the least healthy products are at eye level for children, say in the supermarket, in the cereal aisle, which is clearly the case in most supermarkets now, then kids are going to be drawn to that. They're going to exert what's called pester power to get their parents to buy these things. And then the diet will be worse. And you guys know this better than anybody, but moving things up or down one shelf makes an enormous difference in what people buy. So could nutrition be part of the consideration about where things are placed? Eye level for children versus not would be an example. What shows up in end cap displays? What's featured in the aisles where you're checking out? And then there are also nuanced things that people have begun to think about, like, you know, the knowledge about modern supermarkets about the beats per minute of the music that's playing in the loudspeakers, and how long does that keep people in a market, and what do they buy as a consequence depending on the impact on their mood of that particular music. And so there are a lot of these things. Each one by itself may not be terribly significant, but when you add them all up, there might be a lot of things that could be done in the retail sector that help promote health rather than undermine it. And so there's a lot of thought now to using the supermarket as a learning laboratory, if you will, about how health can be promoted, and the supermarket, the retail industry, can still benefit, profit, and thrive under those conditions. And part of the task is to change the demand, of course, lots of consumer education and things like that, so people want different foods. But also part of the consideration is, can you change the environment to push some foods over others and to encourage healthy choices, just make it the easy choice, as I said before. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleague, Rafi.
Thank you, Kelly. I know if I am on the right...
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Rafi Taherian, and I oversee Yale Dining. And I'll get to that very quickly. But I know if I'm on the right panel when I hear other panelists and I see and I learn so much from them, and I know that they already contributed 10 times more than I will ever contribute to the panel. And I'm already feeling that way hearing Errol and Kelly. My name is Rafi Taherian. I oversee Yale Dining. I work with over 500, providing about 14,000 meals a day for students here in the different forms, be it in residential colleges, be it in our retail operations and convenience stores, and in our cafes, or be it in our catering operation. Now, our number one objective is that we are providing high quality, wholesome food. And the fact that Yale University and Yale Dining has been in forefront of this type of dialogue, sustainable food type of dialogue, for quite some time is not a new thing. Yale University started many years ago with the Yale Sustainable Food Project, that experiment and a project that introduced a dialogue and conversation of sustainable food within the colleges, providing food that was different, food that was delicious, that it was sourced in a sustainable way, and Mark most probably will share more information about that. And we've been doing that for quite some time for a number of reasons. Number one is because the right thing to do. Number two is because having awareness within a university, creating the higher level of awareness and dialogue regarding food and where it comes from and how it's produced, and it's extremely important, because then that conversation finds its way to the rest of the society. And the third is, the students that they come in here at Yale, they end up in some leadership positions in the country, we hope at least. And when they do that, then we have a leveraged position, nationally actually, to even further expand this idea of sustainable food system. In our organization, we fundamentally focus in 4 areas. Number one, in how we source food. And there we have a number of specifications and standards that we're looking for. To just briefly go over some of them is that we want to make sure that our protein is not containing any kind of antibiotics or any non-natural products, that the animal actually itself was treated humanely. That we, during the course of their life and how it was processed, that we fundamentally actually do not use too much protein. I mean, just use enough of it. We actually focus on reducing the animal-based protein in our dining halls and provide alternative source of protein, plant-based protein. And so when we look at our vegetables and when we look at our dairy products, we have very specific specifications, and we don't buy typically commodity products. We buy always products that are quality and either organic or local or natural, or one of the specifications that we believe that are important for us to support. And I think we do about 40% of our total purchases currently coming from that that category of products. Then in terms of our material management, we want to make sure that we are recycling and we are composting, but more importantly that we are reducing the amount of waste. We are controlling our waste. Be it pre-consumer or post-consumer, we have the strategies that we're focused on reducing it. And when we actually have waste, then we are recycling and composting. We compost in all our locations and recycling in all our locations. The third element, actually the fourth element, is collaboration and cooperation. We want to make sure we understand that what we do, we cannot do it just by ourselves. So the more people in the area that we live in and we work are supporting initiatives or projects that we are focused on, the better we can do and the more impact we can have and the more resources may become available to us as a result of this process. We are currently working on a project that hopefully with some funding support will focus on developing a symposium where we look at Interstate 95 corridor and we look at all the non-commercial, or not just today, I heard there's a possibility that even commercial buyers could participate in this process. And look at how many buyers are in and around of 95 corridor and see if there's a possibility that we can come together and create some specifications that help increase the demand and therefore stimulate the supply side. Because one of the major problems that we have in terms of the sustainable food is that the demand side is not homogeneous, is not really well defined. And then on the supply side, the number one complaint that you would hear from manufacturers and growers that they cannot act based on 100 different buyers, that they want to hear some standards, some specifications, some value propositions that a group of buyers will share, and then they will produce accordingly based on those standards. And I think that's an area of a focus for us, and that's where we are going to leverage our position in terms of the volume buyer in the area, but also brand name buyer. You know, just like Whole Foods has a very, very important and recognized brand name, we fundamentally believe that Yale University has a very, very distinguished and a valued brand name that could be leveraged in terms of the purchasing, and suppliers, they pay attention because then they can actually say that we are serving Yale University, and therefore maybe Princeton would be listening to them, or Harvard, or some other places that they are in and around Interstate 95 corridor can help them. I think this notion of the regional food hub, it's probably one of the hottest things that is going on in sustainable food systems, because again, it's not that institutions, they don't have commitment toward this type of food, is the availability that is the biggest problem. Here in Northeast, we have only 95 growing days. And so, and unfortunately, when produce and vegetables they grow, our students are not around. And so we are challenged. We have, you know, we do various techniques that maybe later on I explain some of them. But, well, thank you. I'll end it now because I have, my time is over. And I pass it to Mark.
Thank you so much, Rafi. My name is Mark Bomford. I'm the director for the Yale Sustainable Food Project. I'm a pretty new arrival to Yale, actually, but I'm really delighted to be working with a project which has been around for almost 10 years now. It's also nice as you go from panel to panel, I think, to see that there really has been an evolution. You kind of have to take a long-term view, but when you think back, you realize that we're not actually just repeating the same thing again and again. we're actually getting to that key challenge of how do we take some of these very, very key successes that have worked at the grassroots level, that have worked at the small scale, and actually bring them up so that rather than being the exception in a niche, they're actually becoming the rule, they're becoming the new standard, they're becoming something which is accessible. And as we look at who is participating in these panels and the kind of initiatives that they're talking about, there's a really clear evolution and there's really clear indicators of progress in this whole area. It's been mirrored for me a little bit when I look back, mostly through chatting with people who were actually here at the time, as to the evolution of the Yale Sustainable Food Project. You might know some of the tales of the early successes. Rafi talked about some of them. They received a whole lot of media attention because one of the first things that we worked on was really turning institutional dining on its head with a little pilot experiment in the Berkeley Residential Dining Hall. This was, I guess, precipitated by a lot of very compelling voices in the food movement. Alice Waters played a prominent role in making that change. She's known for using the phrase, seduce them with taste. And in a way, this is what we were doing, is we were trying to actually start a new dialogue by using the secret weapon of really, really good food. It was the idea that not only can we get people talking about what sustainable food is and where we go with the food system by getting them around a table, but we're also able to bring in the people who otherwise wouldn't be there just because they're drawn by something which is so good, so delightful, so compelling, that you can actually have a basis for starting a conversation. And on the small scale, it worked incredibly well. It changed the way that students thought about food. It created an entirely new demand, and it completely changed the way that the world thought about what institutional dining could be. But if you looked at what would it take to move that from Berkeley College to all of Yale, or even think about what would it take to move that small-scale success around the country, around the world, well, then you've got a slightly more difficult problem, and that's the problem that we passed to Rafi. It's not an easy one, because it's not as simple as replicating the small-scale success. If you just try and repeat the success of an individual initiative, you soon run into some pretty big barriers. You realize that basically the entire system is not set up to respond to that. You run into supply constraints. You run into constraints through the entire distribution process. And so we realized that, okay, this wasn't just a matter of finding a model at a small scale and replicating it. It actually involved entire food system reform. That's when I would say we started on our second phase of this evolving project, which I think was really highlighted by the founding of the Yale Farm. With the recognition that we had a whole system to change, we realized that we didn't actually know a whole lot about this system. Some of what I think was the common knowledge or common wisdom about what was sustainable and what was not sustainable food, especially the very prevalent and well understood ideas of, is it local, is it organic, is it from a small family farm? As we started to get into some of the details and the analysis of these systems, we realized that it might not be quite so simple. There's a complexity to this and there's a nuance, which means that you actually have to think about these problems in a different way, and we didn't even have the base understanding of how farm production systems worked among our students, among our faculty. And we figured that one of the best ways to actually tackle this was to actually get people farming and start to understand at least some of the underlying concepts that went into the production of our food. And so that's when we started up the Yale Farm. It's still very much the heart and soul and one of the most identifiable parts of our program. It's just up the hill here, and you can come visit. A beautiful day like today, it'll be kind of unforgettable. The Yale Farm is an intensively managed acre right here on Yale campus. It's an urban farm, and the acre has some significance when we started to untangle the complexity of the food system. If you look at that statistically average U.S. diet and that statistically average U.S. farm, neither of which exist, but that's the magic of statistics, then you would actually have about an acre per person. That's what it would take to actually sustain an American diet using American farming practices on average for a year. And we can actually start to think about the opportunities and the limitations when we're working on that 1 acre farm at Yale. One of the first things that kind of catches you when you're out there in the field and you're actually harvesting food and you're tasting it right from the ground is this idea of, wow, I could probably sustain myself on this. This is very delightful. And if you had an acre, yeah, you could. We're an urban society, increasingly so. All the new cities that will be popping up over the next 50 years will be much more typical in density of what we have here on the eastern seaboard. Manhattan, you might actually have 100 people sharing that 1 acre with you. And so you don't have to do too much of the ecological math to realize that all of the benefits that we're gaining from urbanization, they owe a debt to farms around the world. Many farms through the region, through the nation, through the entire world. And what we wanted to do was take the lessons on that very representative acre and extend them into what does it actually take to sustain cities. And then we kind of realized that our third phase needed to take that very important learning that was happening at the Yale farm and actually turn that learning into impact outside of Yale. And that's where we get into our new theme, which is food literate leadership. Rafi already talked about this. He talked about the leverage that Yale graduates actually have. And it's true that disproportionately you find people coming from this university in positions where they're making big decisions that affect a lot of people's lives. And so our hope is that as they're having experience at Yale, is that the work in the farm can be linked with the work that they're doing in the classroom to actually get fairly in-depth, rigorous academic guidance in how the food system is working, where the barriers and opportunities are, and how in their own areas of expertise they're able to make this contribution as, I think, high-impact food literate leaders. So what's really exciting as we go through some of these panels and we see the people who are invited, representing sectors that typically haven't been at the table before, is just how many of these food literate leaders there are and what the potentials are. I'm sitting with 4 of them right now. Yesterday, we also had some folks coming from everywhere as diverse as the University of Texas to Shake Shack, this was with Yale Law, to Consumer Reports, to areas of journalism that were really pushing all of these areas in between. How do we get the right food to the right people at the right time? How do we actually reform the food system from within? And in all of these cases, you're finding people, entrepreneurs, you're finding lawyers, you're finding environmental scientists, you're finding journalists and communicators who are having an increasingly better depth of understanding about what can be done, and they're working on change within their areas. And so this is a really exciting thing to see, and that's exactly the kind of person that we're trying to actually get out of Yale into their own particular areas to make change in the food system on the grand scale. One of the most hopeful pieces of news that I read actually this morning before I came to the panel was that Chipotle had just signed an agreement with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, CIW, to adopt their standards for fair labor practices. This is representing over 4,000 workers, mostly based on the tomato harvest in Florida. Chipotle had kind of been a holdout with lots of questions as to why, and now they are embracing this and signing up. It's one of these things which is a fairly bold action, fairly collaborative action. I'm really pleased that one of our students and YSFP alum is working with Chipotle. And that's what we're sort of looking at right now, is how can we look at these areas through business, through civil society, where we can make these collaborative efforts, these bold efforts, and make changes. And I'm hoping that that wrap-up and that piece of good news is a nice segue into the work which Patrick is doing. And so I will leave it at that. I really look forward to talking about some of these other issues as we get into the panel. But I'm hoping that this vision of food literate leadership is combining some of what Kelly's talking about, some of what is going on with Whole Foods, and certainly the challenges of scaling sustainability that Rafi has been hitting head on. So over to Patrick at this point.
Thank you, Mark. My name is Patrick Stuebi. I'm from Switzerland. I'm here at Yale as a World Fellow. I am the founder of Fairtrasa. That's an organization that supports small-scale farmer. That Fairtrasa stands for Fairtrade South America. As I mentioned, I'm from Switzerland. I was working in my former life as in one of the largest trading companies. And then I realized I was making the rich richer and the poor poorer, what made me question what I was doing. So I left that job, took a sabbatical, and went to Mexico, basically to reconsider what to do with my life. When I was in Mexico, I realized that I really like international trading, but it needed to be fair trading. This was the time when in Europe, fair trade just started. You know, there was the fair trade bananas, there were the fair trade coffee, but there weren't hardly any more items, like 7 items. So then I thought, okay, how can I use my international trading skills? And I started to investigate about how do small-scale farmers live, what are their challenges, and how do they sustain their lives. So I realized that there are millions of small-scale farmers who sell their items to local middlemen, or what they call coyotes, at very low prices, extremely low prices. So imagine you are a farmer in the middle of nowhere. You don't know what the market is, and some middleman drives up with a truck and offers you just a very low price, and you don't have an opportunity. You depend on those. So you sell at these ridiculously low prices, what will never allow you to reach the subsistence level or beyond that. So when that started, we then formed a cooperative, certified those with Fairtrade and organic, and we were the pioneers who exported those fruit to Europe. Now, Fairtrade, for those who are not familiar with the concept, has like two main elements. One is it guarantees a minimum price for the grower, and there is an additional premium that is about 10-15% that is for social community development projects. The minimum price is defined by what is the cost of production plus a margin for the grower. So this is then a price that the grower will get in any case, that he can basically sustain his living costs. This goes into the pocket of the grower. Now, that premium, the 10% premium, goes into a fund that is for community development projects. So with those projects, the grower organization, they can decide democratically what they want to do with these funds. And with these funds, in the past, we have helped build handicapped schools, drilled water wells, medical dispensaries. So all these projects that in this country the government provides for, but in Mexico and Peru, they're just not there. Now, it goes without saying that all of that implies higher costs. So a small-scale grower can never, ever compete with the big players such as Dole, Chiquita, Del Monte. Why? Because they're much smaller, they're not as efficient. We guarantee that minimum price, and we do pay that premium. So the question is, how can that work on an economic scale? And why has nobody, and this also explains why those growers never could develop themselves. Now the reason is that there are consumers who are willing to pay more for a fair trade labeled product. Now so with that said, it means that system, the fair trade system, can only work because there are consumers out there who have that consciousness, who go and are willing, if they walk into Whole Foods and they see the conventional bananas and the fair trade bananas, they're willing to pay 20 cents more. So who is financing that? The end consumer. So it gives a possibility to the man in the street, the woman in the street, to support underprivileged small-scale grower through their purchasing power. Now, we started in Mexico. We formed that cooperative. We started with the avocado. We were the pioneers with avocado. Then we added many more items. And at the beginning, we just exported to Europe. And then it took off very, very, very quickly, especially in the UK. And then all the supermarkets, they wanted year-round supply. So what we did, then we went to Peru. When the Mexican production declined, Peru started. So we, over 4 or 5 years, we fine-tuned the model. How can we work with small-scale grower in an efficient and effective way? And then we replicated that model to Peru first. Then we replicated that model to Chile, then to Argentina. And now we have about over 20 items in our fruit basket that we can offer that is organic and fair trade certified. Now let me give you an example what that means now for these growers. So we went to Peru, and then we started to work with a banana cooperative that we started to develop. Our country manager, he's been in the banana business, and so the two main elements. One is those small-scale farmers farm a product because their father was doing that and their father was doing that, but they never really got agricultural agricultural skills, to improve fertility of and production. So this means there was no possibility that they can really get a top quality item. So what we did is we supported them with technical skills. We got in post-harvest experts that they really know what does it take, especially now in that example for the bananas. And then the other element, so one is empowerment, and the other element is market access. So in one of these organizations that we formed, they were selling the bananas to these middlemen, and when we started to develop them and pay them the minimum price, we could pay up to 7 times more what they were receiving before. And this was a total life changer for these growers. So there was this group of 30 small-scale growers, and I remember there was one of the farmers, he was like 70, and he has been growing bananas all his life. And so in that meeting, when they started to export as Fairtrade, he came to me, or in the meeting, he raised his hand and said, my dream all my life was to have a bicycle. He was 70. He never could afford a bicycle, and after like 3 months, where he got really, they got really much more money for their products. He then said, even now, even though I'm not the youngest anymore, but I will, with this, I will my life dream will become true, and I will buy a bicycle. So when he told me that, I got goosebumps. I was so impressed, and I don't get goosebumps just like that. And so it was striking, it was striking for me to hear that from somebody who has lived in agriculture all his life, who had never a possibility, they were deprived from all these possibilities, and so it was striking to see how the purchasing, how the value chain, how the purchasing power, us the consumers, can support those growers that really is a life changer. So it was really striking to see. So this is why I believe it's very important that consumers understand what is happening on the ground. How your purchase power can impact small-scale growers, and the importance of the collaboration between all these, the producers, the exporter, the importer. Whole Foods plays an enormously important role in that, because you really can change the life of small-scale growers. Thank you.
So that it's not a one-sided, us and you, the audience, discussion, I'd actually like to open it up right now to questions and see, where you would like to take this discussion with this panel of folks. So we got one back there.
Alan from Brighton again. I just wanted to thank the panel, but also ask a quick question here. Who's really pushing who? Is it the supply chain pushing the demand, or is it the demand affecting and pushing the supply? Who's really forcing the issue? Thank you.
Let's go down the line. Patrick, do you want to start?
I can talk for the fair trade and the organic movement. The fair trade really took off in 2005 when I started my company. This was when it was really demand driven. So this is why we started to try to replicate our model as quickly as possible. As you know, also the organic has been growing constantly, and I believe today that as we live in times of climate change, as we live in times of all these natural disasters, more people start waking up, and more people start asking themselves, what do they eat, and want to eat healthy. So I believe that the demand for both organic and fair trade will increase, and on the back of that is why we try to replicate our model to include thousands of producers more to can benefit from those systems. So I think, but it is very important that demand and supply will be aligned.
Rafi.
Yeah, one of the most powerful forces in a food industry, and what drives actually the food industry, is the ability to generate profit. And this is for large scale or small scale, medium scale. The ability to generate profit is extremely powerful force. Now, industry itself, if you ask them what keeps them up at night, is innovation, how they can be the newest trend, how they can be the most popular trend and in the forefront. And what keeps them up at night is if somebody else is doing it while they're sleeping. And so, so there is this huge force on the supply side that they want to know what is the newest trend, what is the newest happening that can hit the market and generate a lot of demand around it, okay? And to do it in a very, very timely basis. But on the other side, the demand is also extremely important. I mean, and by the way, on the first example, I can give you a whole bunch of examples. Look at Papa John's Pizza, and none of these products, by the way, any of these products I don't endorse. I don't like them. But nevertheless, you know, you can see in less than 10 years, the guy has 2,500 units and is in every supermarket. Honest Tea. You know, who would have thought that Honest Tea would become so popular? I mean, did we really need another iced tea? But, you know, through innovation and through created buzz and took a whole segment of the market. And then on the other side is the demand. Demand is very, very powerful force. And that's where we're trying to focus now, because we can move the market to produce the kind of product that we want if we have a homogenized demand. But unfortunately, and at the price that we can, you know, we can afford. And that's the main thing. So I don't know, both are equally important in different aspects of the industry.
I want to take a quick swing at that and just reemphasize that as a retailer, you know, we're obviously have to report in quarterly to our shareholders. But what we've really developed at Whole Foods is a multi-stakeholder model of success. And so a lot of the points that Rafi has made, especially that we listen to our stakeholders. And in a lot of ways, what we've been able to do on sustainability is watching what our customers buy, watching what our customers are saying in social media and online, and making sure that not only are we responding to it, but anticipating where they're going to go next. And for that sort of innovation drive is so tied into sustainability, because that is the key trend that we're seeing. Kelly or Mark, anything you guys want to add to that?
No, the only thing I would add is that one way to create change on the demand side is to help change social norms so that people have a different idea about what it's like to eat food. And if we can change ourselves from a culture that focuses on the quantity of food you can buy for the money to the quality, that would be, of course, a good start. But also things like portion sizes and do we care about the story of the food, and all those sort of things become very important norm changes. And the question is, how do you promote as much of that as possible? You know, we can kind of sit around and wait for it to happen, and a lot of it's starting to happen and kind of occurring organically, if you will. And, you know, that's why Whole Foods is growing, because there's a larger percentage of the population every day who cares about this. But if you want to take whatever trend there is and increase it by a lot, then government has to get involved. And that means that government needs to deal with curricula in schools, and it needs to be involved in what foods are served in schools and how foods are priced and all those sort of things. Government, and of course subsidies and things. There are a lot of things governments can do to help move this along in an accelerated way.
I did spend a number of years as a vegetable grower before coming here, and my experience there was that it was very demand driven. There was surplus demand almost everywhere. All the other people that I was working with were facing surplus demand, basically not able to keep up with it. But the challenge was that there was a couple barriers to expansion, many of which were infrastructure based, which I think left us always in this question. How far can this go? Is there going to be a ceiling? Is there going to be a saturation point? But it really did seem to be demand-driven from the producer perspective. And what's very interesting is as you look at supply chain reforms that have been rolled out, especially with regards to animal welfare, especially with regards to certification, verification, and supply chain tracking, so many of those reforms have been orchestrated by civil society organizations, consumer organizations that have been acting on that demand side of the equation, or I guess, as has been talked about, homogenizing some of that demand to turn it into a clear message. But I've really seen a lot of that side playing a considerable influence.
All right, in the back here.
I have a question, and hopefully there's enough bright people here that can answer. By the way, I'm Nissa, and I'm somewhat affiliated to Fairtrasa. I've been a buyer of his goods for many, many, many years, and I've been in the organic produce industry for about 20. We talk a lot about demand and supply in our business, and it's taken me years to really get a good grasp of what that means, especially for those of us who are in the organic business. For instance, let's take mangoes. What's the demand? I mean, you have a huge conventional market, you have a very small organic market, but yet growers always think the demand is this total number. And so my question is, this whole demand and supply question gets really confusing because the profit-driven response is so powerful that people want to take this big pot and say that's the demand, when I think it actually needs to be broken down in a lot more regional scale, this and that. And I think that gets really confusing, and back to kind of his question, where it becomes difficult for growers to make a living when they don't have real demand numbers. Does that make any sense?
Well, I think anybody who's on the procurement side, influences demand by the risks they sometimes take in what they are buying. And I think one of the problems that we have are there's not a lot of folks in procurement that are brave enough to take those risks and see what folks are not yet buying, but what they may. And I think that is sort of the bridge there. And the way to get across that bridge is communication with those customers. So I just want to put that out there. Mark or Rafi, since mangoes or vegetables.
Well, we know that consumer awareness is very, very important. I can see mango in the supermarket, and I can see both fair trade one and conventional one. If I don't know what to do with mango I won't buy. And so, and this is why in supermarket and other places, people, they try this or sample it or have a salsa or something else, introduce it and get it out there. But to answer your question, whether growers are looking at the total amount of the demand or not, I'm not a grower, but I know that farmers, they're very smart. Farming is an extremely difficult trade, very, very difficult business to be in. They try to keep themselves informed. They get whatever information that is out there to make sure product that they are producing is going to find a market, because their livelihood depends on it. I have not found many farmers that were confused about how much product they need to put out there in the marketplace. They want to know that their products is going to meet a certain price per pound. That's what is very, very important to them. And there are institutional buyers like ourselves here at Yale. We do lid pricing. We do contract pricing with specific farmers and growers if they meet our specification and standards.
This is Robert at Fresh Pond. The question is, I guess, about the raw materials and fair trade, whole trade, and now we have a new alliance program which talks about raw ingredients. And I guess as a consumer, we have more and more branding kind of, it gets a little confusing, I guess, for the consumers. And I know that it's our part of our job to educate people. And I think even, it's like the next step above fair trade is supposed to be when the product is not only grown in the area, but it's also produced and made in that area, employing more people. So I guess my question to the panel is this, the difference between all these different alliances and the different things that we're creating? I know that it's innovative, but it can also be confusing at some point. And also, who's regulating these processes in these foreign countries?
Let me take on that fair trade piece, and that, and Patrick could probably speak to this as well, is there's an international labeling body called FLO, the Fair Trade Labeling Organization, which is, I believe, based in Europe, internationally recognized standard holder. So anything that you see in the United States that says fair trade is based on the Fair Trade Labeling Organization's standard, which the two key points that Patrick said was a social premium as well as a minimum floor price. But to your main point, I don't want the proliferation of ethical and transparent sourcing standards or communications to hold us back. Yeah, there's a lot going on, but that's because there's a lot of opportunities to fix up, our supply chain and what we're actually selling. And it's contingent on, us as team members, but also our customers to stay educated, spread the word about what we can be doing better and what we can be buying. Because when you peel back that sort of thin layer of what's really good, there's so much out there, and most of the dirt merchants of the world that's really not. So let's not hold ourselves back.
What about the regulations on the other ones, the whole trade as well as the alliance program?
Well, at Whole Foods Market, the whole trade standard is based off of Fairtrade. Essentially, anything that's exclusive, sold only at Whole Foods, is a whole trade item. In terms of anything else that we communicate at Whole Foods Market, it is always based off of another recognized third-party standard. For instance, EcoScale, while we created it, we don't audit against it. We utilize a third party named Green Seal to audit against. For instance, non-GMO, anything that is non-GMO is actually verified by the non-GMO project. They give us a UPC list of items that have gone through their standards, and that way we have integrity in our processes.
May I ask a question to follow up on his question? What you talk about basically is how do you create standards that people can understand and trust to designate certain things like fair trade. And that, I'm not in that area, so I can't comment on that in particular. But at least in my area, the nutrition claims on food products have been completely out of control for many years because there's so little government oversight on it, and consumers are completely confused. They see something that says no trans fat when it never had trans fat to begin with. It's things like that. And this cereal is part of a nutritious breakfast when it's half its weight in sugar and things like that. So what I'm wondering is, do you guys see this as an impending threat as the niche in the market of people who care about these things grows and grows? There will be the tendency for other players to come in and start to abuse these sort of terms and labels and things like that in a way that might degrade the quality that these terms now have. And I'm just wondering if you guys perceive that as a threat or see any way to head it off at the pass, because you can just imagine it coming.
It's actually ongoing. Okay. I think there's a confusion over what the term natural means, and that's why we try to differentiate, at Whole Foods Market, prioritize organics, or looking at different ways of communicating the quality and the process involved in food production. In fact, the impetus for us designing EcoScale was what we felt to be a really weak cleaning standard developed by another third-party organization in the industry that was essentially written by Clorox. And we've said, internally, we need to do better than that. We're not going to wait for them to sort of spell out to our customers what cleaning products should be. Anybody else on this?
We had a really interesting discussion yesterday evening at the Yale Law School that I was actually dealing with some of the regulatory environment that either gave credence or none at all to the value of some of these labels. Basically, the public regulatory ability in this country and in many other countries is entirely inadequate to actually provide the assurance that the consumers are seeking. And as has been discussed here, there's some labels that are basically meaningless, natural rising to the top of that meaningless label list. There's others that have a lot behind them. Organic has 600 plus pages of standards that are actually detailed in great depth, and the producers are responsible to actually pay for the verification for a third party to come and actually see that all those standards have been followed. But in those cases, and what's being talked about on the retail side as well, it's where the private sector has had to step in to cover the gap which is not being filled in public sector regulation. And that creates a very uneasy situation when you get into international trade. So this is the interesting opportunity that we have right now: is can the private sector actually respond to that need for verification along the whole supply chain, do it well, do it with some level of third-party involvement that can actually reduce some of the inherent conflict of interest that would be involved in self-regulation. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about right here with these mechanisms, to see can we do this because the public sector is not able to. They're just not given the resources to actually regulate the regulations that are in place.
Sir, here. Maybe we want to take a list of questions if somebody wants to go around, just so we don't miss anybody.
Hi, I'm Joel from Paramus, and the question is either for Errol or Mark or both about biodynamics. And I know in our store we carry a lot of biodynamic wine, but I don't know what are the products, or the general question is biodynamics and how you feel that the future of farming is going to be affected by biodynamics. Is it going to be more sustainable?
Great question.
growing?
We actually we're at Expo East in Baltimore, and we held a seminar for about 150 of our grocery suppliers, presented by Demeter, who's and Stellar Organic Services, to actually spur on the development of more biodynamic grocery products. So stay tuned.
Biodynamics is interesting. It does actually have some third-party certification behind the practices through Demeter. I think that you'll see, as the standard hopefully evolves, as the standard is raised through this kind of mix of supply and demand, that you may actually find these new kind of R&D related, how can we push the envelope a little bit further, how can we aspire to a higher standard. And I feel that biodynamic is filling some of that niche right now. Let's push the envelope a little bit. I would suspect that you would find something kind of similar, a beyond organic, a beyond local, a beyond grass-fed, whatever that may be, arriving in the future. And I think it's hopeful as we have certification on some of these next level labels, because it means that we are actually evolving and moving to different standards.
Back corner there. Sorry, I'll get to you next.
I'm Anne from the Bellingham store. I actually just wanted to say thank you for all of you for being here. I was afraid I was going to run out of time. I'm watching you, and I came here expecting to just hear kind of numbers, and you know, it's like, oh, we're tossing these ideas around. And you're all actually on the ground and running with these programs, and I'm impressed. I thought I'd be back here kind of snoozing a little, and I'm delighted to find that that's not the case. And Rafi and Kelly, I'm sorry I don't have your last names, really I'm impressed on what you're doing with the youth and the public policy and with your dining services. It's just amazing, and I'm wondering, how are you educating the people with the dining services? I mean, you're making an impact in real time with your purchases. And lastly, I'd like to know, how can we follow the group of you? Are you going to make your information available to us after we go home? I'd like to see where you're headed with all of this.
Rafi, you want to get that?
Thank you. We recognize that it's very, very important to educate our own staff first. Okay, if we are to serve food 14,000 meals a day, we have to make sure that our ambassadors out there, they're doing the right thing in producing food, in making sure that they're communicating the information. In terms of putting information for students themselves, about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, unfortunately, I think that was my mistake, we axed all our marketing dollars. We took all our marketing dollars, and these were the years that we were instructed to cut back a little bit on our food budget because of the institution financial status. And so, and the very first source that we could look at, and we said, well, let's get the marketing dollars and put it back actually in the food and not scale back in terms of our specifications and standards. And we found ourselves 3 years later that our students actually did not know a thing about what we were doing. And so they were saying, can we have grass-fed beef? We said, we already have it. Can we have natural chicken? We already have fresh chicken, never frozen. Can we have Connecticut dairy farms or organic this and that? Well, this is already, we're doing that. And they had no idea. They had no idea that these things were, and our focus was at the time that you just do the right thing. You don't brag about it, you don't talk about it, you just do it. And now we're finding that we need to tell the story a little bit more, and that probably is an area of vulnerability for us. And we do more work and educating the students and providing them information is something that Mark and his team does well. And we're in the business of doing food and making food, but they're in business of educating and providing information. And we are collaborating and working toward that end.
This question over here.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, my name is Elaine, and I'm from Prospect Street in Cambridge, Mass. My question is kind of more of a comment, kind of geared towards Kelly. I think you might have a little more faith in our government than I do, in the fact of thinking that government regulations are going to solve some of our health problems and food-based problems. Just judging on the fact that the high fructose corn syrup and the corn industry and no labeling of GMOs and all those kinds of things. So where I think it's good for, the government to be paying more attention to school lunch programs and things like that, I really feel that, I think a lot of it has to come from, us, as retailers, as educators and things like that. I think we probably stand a chance of doing a better job than the government, who has, big agriculture breathing down their necks and all that kind of stuff. So I was wondering if you could just address that a little more, like how you think that that's going to play out, and if, because maybe you obviously have more insights than I do, but you kind of scared me there for a second earlier on.
Well, I've got to have a little faith, or it'd be hard to get out of bed every morning. I think if you look in the health arena, we're looking at food for its health consequences mainly. Just that's what we do, and I think you see a lot of precedents where government has been involved in constructive ways in health-related things. I mean, public health 101, sanitation, immunizations, things like that. Government has done extremely well. They've done a very good job, except for some recent failures with food safety issues, for the most part. There's some fortification successes in the food supply. So there are some things government has done well, not to say that there aren't some things that really is messed up in a very bad way as well. But take tobacco as an example. The greatest public health victory of the last century in this country was cutting the number of people who smoke more than in half. And that was government action. It was taxes, it was Clean Indoor Air Acts, it was things that government did that started locally. And so it wasn't the federal government. The federal government was the last body of government to act on tobacco because of the lobbying pressures you mentioned. But it was little towns in California that started agitating and passing laws that then spread to other little towns, that then spread to larger cities. Then the states started to act, and finally the federal government caught up. We're seeing exactly that same process occurring with food-related issues. It's the local governments and state governments that are taking action first, and then it spreads to the national government. School nutrition is a great example of that. Lots of local action. Now there's a new law and one of the heroes on this, by the way, happens to be our representative here, Rosa DeLauro. She's the best person in the whole House of Representatives on these issues. There's great school nutrition legislation about to kick in. There's menu labeling where calories are going to have to be posted in restaurants. That's a national law, but it started locally in New York City first. And so these local things are tremendously important. So what people do on the ground in their localities is very important. And one of the things that I would urge you all to consider is that to take citizens who we can educate to care about these food issues, not only in their own lives, but to activate them as political citizens and to show individuals that they can have a voice with a school board, for example, or with their state legislators. Then you can get legislative action that's constructive.
Can I add one more? I work with various segments of the industry. And one thing that you consistently hear, the industry does not want to have regulation, but at the same time, they do want to have regulation. So why this two-sided approach? From one side, industry does not want to get regulated by government because they say, well, government doesn't know what government does, and so why would they regulate us? But on the other side, let's say on the trans fats, and the example was the city of New York started with that initiative and labeling requirement, and then it became national. That was a good thing for the industry. The initiative now regarding salt, the salt initiative is extremely important, and there is a lot of forces, a lot of people in the industry that are trying to reduce the amount of salt in the food. That is not going to happen if it's not some sort of policy support behind it. But once the policy support get behind it, the industry will comply and will happen across the board. The quality of the sugar and the quality of carbohydrates, that's another thing that the industry is willing to do something about it. But if there is no equalization of the field, so if I am factory A and I can put as much salt or sugar I want in my product and factory B is not doing it, we're not competing in the marketplace on the equal basis. So there you really need to have some sort of policy support and resource.
Everybody needs to Google Proposition 37 in California. Sir, back there.
I'm Tony. I'm from the Symphony Store. I'd also like to thank you for being here today. This is great. This is really informative. However, to piggyback on Elaine's comments, I think there's a long road ahead of us. We have a lot to do. So, you know, it's estimated still for everyone's hard work that 75% of government subsidies still go to meat, dairy, fats, sugar, and alcohol. Lobbyists raised millions of dollars for those Got Milk celebrity campaigns. The USDA has just switched from the food pyramid, which we've been so used to the new My Plate system of fruits, vegetables, grains, protein, and dairy. There's been a lot of discussion about the proportions, the inclusion of dairy. I guess I'd like to get the panel's opinion on how they feel about that, and the new program that's being rolled out by the USDA.
What was exactly your question?
What is a panel member's opinion of the new My Plate system that's been rolled out by the USDA, rather than the traditional food pyramid that we've had in the past?
Right, thank you.
Well, I can address that specifically and then in a more broad way. Specifically, My Plate is a big improvement over some of the food pyramid and food things that have existed in the past, primarily because the food industry is having less and less influence as we go forward in time. It doesn't mean that it's removed by all means, but it's less than it used to be, which used to be ridiculous. And so the My Plate is a big improvement, not only in the graphic, but in the nutrition criteria that underlie it. But as a general rule, I think what we're going to see here, but this is just my own guess, and what's that worth, but I think we're seeing progress in lines that look like this, and then I think the tipping point thing is going to kick in at some point, and we're going to get big progress all of a sudden. And what makes me think that, if you look at what happened in the tobacco field, it took 40 years. I mean, this first Surgeon General's report showing that smoking was causing lung cancer was in 1964, decades after that, before needed public policy kicked in. But if you go back through that developmental history of what occurred, all those steps that were seen back then are occurring now in the food arena, but they're happening much more quickly. And so that 30 or 40-year history seems to be compressed in food, and you're starting to see more and more people get interested in this. And if we can harness that interest in the right way, then I think we will hit these tipping points. Then you'll see a lot of change all of a sudden.
In the back.
Thank you for all being here. It's a pleasure to hear from all of you. Talking and thinking about sustainability, and really thinking about it carefully, as Mr. Mark said, it brings us to a lot of global and detailed issues. If I ask you about the political side of dealing with big corporations that does not support sustainability, other than educating customers and dealing with government policies, is there any other strategies that you are working with in regards to dealing with big corporations that does not support sustainability?
I can start with that one, since I guess Whole Foods is technically one of those big corporations. But we also do buy and sell product that is made by Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, Unilever, Kraft Foods, etc. And so we have the same discussions with the large consumer packaged goods companies, or CPGs as we call them, as we do with the small suppliers. And we make a decision based on their response to those questions and to how they prioritize our relationship on how we move forward. And some of them are not doing as well as they used to, and that's what I'll say. I'll give you an example, which is pretty much public knowledge. It was about 3 years ago that we had some really intense discussions with White Wave Foods, who made a Silk soy milk, about their soybean sourcing. The fact that they had switched from an organic, domestically grown soybean source to a conventional source from China without changing the packaging. It was the same packaging that some of us who had been Silk fans for a long time had grown up on. And we let them know that we weren't happy with that, and over the course of a few months developed some alternative products, and in the summer of 2010 pulled Silk off our shelves and introduced a bunch of organic products, soy milk and almond milk. And our business got a lot better after that, and our customers responded really well. And so there's a lot of other examples we have at Whole Foods of doing that, and that's basically back to the point of our core values and understanding what our customers are looking for. But also I want to point out your consumers and your citizens, and making sure that that communication, you're letting your retailers know, you're letting folks who are buying food and working with them, because they don't always hear. And so it's really good to keep your mouth open. Anyone else want to take that?
I think the approach is you want to be working with all the audiences. You want to be working with the system at very, very different scales simultaneously. When you look at, again, some of these small-scale successes, the things that are happening on the very, very cutting edge, they're doing wonderful things and having impacts, but they're having impacts within such a narrow sphere. And if you extrapolate even wonderful growth in some of these areas, you still don't get any pending unseating of the Coca-Colas and the Unilevers if you just kind of continue on the math of saying, okay, if this wonderfully high standard sector continues this 20% growth, et cetera, you're still looking at, maybe sometime 2 centuries from now, that we might have this replacing the Unilevers of the world. So I think that's why holding out the hope to say if we can have a small reform within a very, very large sphere in a large corporation, that has a very large impact. That's kind of why we're hoping to work on all scales and figure out if we can actually use those larger players for the larger reforms, even if they tend to be a little bit modest within the overall operations. And so it's kind of interesting that even within a company like Unilever, there still is within a pocket of that company some very cutting-edge sustainability work happening, doing some research, funding research outside of Unilever, which actually looks very good compared to some of the things that you can get within a publicly funded university. You're finding grad students who are doing amazing work funded by Unilever. You're having some of the companies that they service who are doing some amazing reforms. Those have not rolled out across the entire company by any means, but seeing these small pockets of success, even within the big companies, I think gives reason to hold out hope, because, again, whether it's a big public policy, a small change over this broad spectrum can actually yield in some larger impact. So I think we have to be working on them at both scales simultaneously.
Well, we've been given the notice to wrap up, so I want to appreciate the panel here, who has both been, for me, both inspirational and informational, and I'm really hoping everybody here will be taking this knowledge home with you and out into the streets and out into your habits and things that you do on a daily basis, and continuing to push these issues forward and make these changes that we need to, because our world really depends on it. Lee.